Global Health Program and the Center for Social Medicine and Humanities, Dr. Edgar Rivera Colon, who I have had the distinct pleasure of knowing for years. I first met him in New York when I was on faculty at NYU, and he was on faculty at Columbia in the narrative medicine program there, a really distinguished program that's been around for a long time, defining really the field of narrative medicine. And Dr. Rivera Colon has been in the forefront of introducing critical race theory and critical perspectives, in particular, a focus on health justice in the program at a very high scholarly level. I could run on and on about the feedback that I've gotten from his trainees, his colleagues, his former trainees who are now starting narrative medicine programs at other campuses across the country about the power of his teaching, his example, his mentoring, and his research. So he's a medical anthropologist. He's lecturer for University of Southern California's Keck School of Medicine and their Master of Science in Narrative Medicine program. And he remains, even though he's recently joined us in Los Angeles, physically, he remains on faculty at the Narrative Medicine program at Columbia University's School of Professional Studies. He trains frontline African-American and Latinx HIV/AIDS activists in the use of ethnographic research methods to develop community-level interventions. So he's really at the forefront of community-engaged partnership around research and professional practice. He's also an expert in Latino, gay, and bisexual male sexual cultures and HIV. He regularly trains public health professionals in cultural competency and working with Latinx LGBTQ plus communities. And he's written multiple books, including Principles of Practice in Narrative Medicine. So this evening, he will deliver his lecture, A Primer on Narrative Medicine, Promoting Healing in the Age of Pandemics, Climate Disruption, and White Nationalism. He's going to present on the topic of narrative medicine, what it is, why we need it, and how it can be used in clinical medicine and medical education. So I can't think of anyone better prepared to educate us about narrative medicine and this very timely moment of opportunity for narrative approaches. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Helena, Dr. Hansen, Dr. Wells, Rachel, Vijeta, Zoe, who have welcomed me, the folks in the Global Health Program, as well as the folks for the Center for Social Medicine. It's a pleasure to be here in LA, and I'm sending greetings to all my East Coast comrades who have joined us. So lovely to have you here as well. The last time I saw Helena was when I was introducing her based upon her research around sort of class and race differentials in terms of people in recovery who were struggling with opioid use. And at that time, I brought up the famous Haldeman quote. Haldeman was one of or is it Ehrlichman, one of the Nixon aides, who talked about that one of the reasons the drug laws were passed in the Nixon administration that really begins the process of the war on drugs in the United States was because two constituencies were dangerous to Nixon: the anti-war movement and the Black movement, the Black freedom struggle. And he sort of frankly says to this journalist in 2014, he had nothing to lose at this point, and he said, "Yeah, we couldn't make Blacks or Peaceniks illegal, but we could get them on the pot and the other drugs and the heroin," right? And so I've always framed a lot of my work in terms of the response to what happened in this country in the 60s and 70s in terms of a struggle for a more inclusive society, both in terms of economic and social resources. So I've always framed it in terms of sort of a racialized class war or counterinsurgency. So today I'm going to talk about those of us who are in the healthcare field, and especially those of you who are physicians, nurses, physician's assistants. You take a pledge that says do no harm. So what does that mean in a society that's become more violent? How do we have instruments and tools for discourse, for what I'm calling at this point collective democratic discernment? And narrative medicine is part of that. And we know at this point that our medical education curricula need to be changed, right? given the crisis that we're living in this moment. And I have forefront in my heart and in my mind what's happening in India, the kind of abandonment, structured abandonment of the masses of people in India. Literally, people cannot breathe because there's not enough oxygen. And sort of the elites in India, in Brazil, during the Trump administration here, who in one sense have, not thought this through. And as a result, people have died. And so we're in a very key moment. And what I'm seeing throughout the world, and we shouldn't be so provincial to think about just the United States, is we're seeing the growth of what I would call market authoritarianism with a type of narrow populist nationalism. In the United States, that translates into white nationalism. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share the screen with you. I'm going to talk through my notes, and I'm going to try to do a little bit of a narrative medicine workshop with you using a poem by a wonderful Black feminist poet called Lucille Clifton, and think about how we can begin to restructure our discourse, but also re-educate ourselves. We have to unlearn certain things, relearn certain things, and learn new things at the same time. And that's what any crisis calls for. So we can either see this crisis as let's huddle in, or let's push beyond our limits. And I'm in the push beyond our limits to new places. So let me pull up my PowerPoint and share it with you in one moment. Let me do that, and just give me a shout out in case you don't see it. Is everybody okay in terms of seeing it? Give me a shout out. There we go. We got some thumbs up.
See
I
it.
want to hear the Jersey crowd yell as well, because I know some Jersey people up in here. All right, so this is the title, of course, and So when I think about narrative medicine, I think about it as healthcare in the age of flexible accumulation. And if you remember your history, it's really Japanese capitalists who developed this idea of low inventories. And as always with capitalists, if one capitalist develops an innovation, it's just a matter of time before another capitalist copies it to make money, right? So they're not dumb, and they're looking at the world stage. And that meant that strategy, the austerity strategy, what became neoliberalism, what it's called now, actually produced just-in-time healthcare in the United States, right? And those practices meant low supply of inventories, staffing shortages, algorithmic work disciplines, electronic patient records, provider work speed-ups, provider, patient, community, time squeezes, and burnout, right? That's the context we're looking at, the big picture, if you will. So I want to put narrative medicine in the context of that crisis, which in the United States, you can trace back to the late 60s and really intensified from 1973 on. And there's lots of scholarship on this. So what I see, and what I think a lot of us see, is we have racial capitalism and the long global counterinsurgency. By counterinsurgency, I mean the efforts to push back the kind of new economics and social inclusion that all kinds of movements throughout the world, the anti-colonial movement, the national liberation struggles, here in the United States, the grandparents of all freedom, the Black freedom movement, the LGBTQ movement, the feminist movement, the peace movement, all the ethnic nationalist movements, all of those were part of a demand to have a new society, right? And narrative medicine was born from the crisis engendered by the increasing market dogmatism, what was called the neoliberal fix, that economic and political elites across the globe, global north, adopted in the wake of the mass protracted struggles for economic redistribution. And that struggle continues to this day. And the Black Lives Matter struggle is really a response or continuation of those kind of struggles. And my comrade in Mississippi, Khalil Kuno, sees the Black Lives Matter movement actually as a response to what happened in Katrina in terms of poor people, and also the failures of the Obama administration. So what we're thinking now is we have to think about narrative medicine and not divorce it from its historical context. It comes out of a crisis, and it's still living in that crisis. Now we have Dr. Ruthie Wilson Gilmore here, who I went to graduate school with, a brilliant geographer, former member of the Black Panther Party, and someone who has been key in developing the tactics and strategies of the abolitionist movement, especially here in California, where she's done a lot of work. And Ruthie has an incredibly interesting definition of racism. She says racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differential vulnerability to premature death. And we see this all the time. Another way of saying this is, if you have a pandemic in a flexible healthcare economy that's privatized, people who have suffered from all kinds of things, what you call food deserts or what have you, will die at higher rates because of the pre-existing morbidities. If you have a violent state, even though a police officer recently in Minneapolis was convicted of murder, right after that trial, more Black people will be shot because it's a systemic and structural thing that we're looking at, whether it's Adam Toledo in Chicago or other people have been shot since then. So I think we have to rethink narrative medicine in light of that crisis. So one of the things I always say is that racism undoes us, but it anchors institutions, practices, and policies. And those of us who have to do the institutional jujitsu of being in institutions that are elite-dominated, bourgeois, I'm a Marxist, I'm gonna use those terms, white-dominated, we have to figure out how do we change institutions, practices, and policies, even though this is going on, right? So racism undoes us in many ways. Racial capitalism, which is a system we live under, which is both heteropatriarchal and cis, right, undermines the democratic kernel in our society. And I say kernel because I don't think we're a democracy yet. And we can have that conversation if you want, but at least the kernel of it. And deforms the potential for full human flourishing of all people located on the various sides of what Dr. Du Bois, the founder of empirical urban sociology, now recognized as such, called the problem of the 20th century, the color line. There's Dr. Du Bois. And of course, Paul Robeson is on his left, went to Rutgers, grew up in New Jersey, just for you guys to remember that. And Claudia Jones, an activist, a feminist, the founder of the carnival tradition in Brixton, in Britain, who was deported from the United States for being a communist. These people were key in developing the analysis that we have now around racial capitalism. They're really the ancestors of this kind of thinking. So what we have with Du Bois is a racialized political geography, right? Du Bois was posing this geography that maps onto our bodies, our communities, our social networks, our work sites, and political institutions. These class-inflected racial geographies are the cause of what Dr. Mindy Fullilove, social psychiatrist and urbanist, calls the ongoing root shock that urban communities of color suffer. That's the context in which I think about narrative medicine. And the question that narrative medicine asks us is, can we name the moment we're living historically? And again, the question that we all have to think about is, are we moving towards a society where we open up into collective democratic discernment, or are we closing down? And this artwork is by Ricardo Levins Morales from the Twin Cities, a Puerto Rican Jewish artist, and it's wonderful art. And again, it poses a question to us. If my work is essential, my rights can't be optional. And that's a question that we have to keep on thinking about in terms of medical education, right? Who are the frontline workers? Who's given frontline status, and who's given benefits and who's not? So one other thing, bring back the 8-hour day. Remember there was once an 8-hour day in the United States for working people? Remember that? Instead of a 12 or 16-hour day? This is a term that I learned in my time in Central America. It's called la coyuntura política actual, right? Which is, and I want to say it in Spanish because sometimes we sort of center European languages, but not Spanish, which is interesting. And I think that one of the things I want to say about that is that we need to discern and learn what are the political conjunctions we're living in? What are the forces at play? What are the forces of what I call unfreedom and the forces of freedom? How do we participate in those struggles, right? And I'm thinking right now, of course, of the famous conversation that Karl Marx has at the end of his life in 1888, Ramsgate in England, where an American journalist asked him, and Marx about 3 years shy from dying, says, what is the law of being? And Marx says, struggle, struggle. And I've said to Helena and to Jonathan Metzel that the thing about structural competency, it's an invitation to a conflict-based analysis of our society, and therefore an invitation to a type of struggle, right? And I think there's a way of using narrative medicine where we can prepare ourselves for a nonviolent struggle, but struggle nevertheless. The question we have to ask ourselves, especially after the events of January 6th in the Capitol, do we dare name the moment, right? And naming that moment means all of us have to change things, our teaching styles, our curriculum, our practices, right? We have to begin to enact the politics of the new, right? And confront the history that is old and lethal. So that's my sort of startup, if you will, that's sort of like preamble, right? And as a social scientist, as a committed activist, as someone who began HIV/AIDS work because 2 of my cousins died as a result of becoming addicted in Vietnam, coming back, infecting their wives dying first, them dying later, and our family having to deal with that. That's how I got involved at HIV. It wasn't a question of, it was a question that my family was dying. And so for me, narrative medicine is a tool for naming the moment. And it has these different aspects to it. It's a pedagogical approach. It means that we have to begin to teach differently, non-hierarchically. And also we have to see ourselves with our students as co-learners in a process of what? Of collective development. One of the sad things about graduate training in the professions, there's 2 sad things at least. One is that graduate training deauthorizes people. And I'm saying that not as like, that happens at UCLA, that happens everywhere, right? It doesn't take into account the lived experience that people come and the knowledge that that has. And graduate training can be very hierarchical, right? And what I think pedagogy can be is an invitation to co-learning and creating community and collective knowledge production that can be used for social action and justice. Narrative medicine is an interdisciplinary critical medical humanities. It's the use of the humanities as a way of looking at science and letting those 2 things intermingle and talk to each other, right? And become something else, right? The most famous part of narrative medicine is the workshop method, which has close reading, learning to read a text very closely, and I would say analogously, learning to read social reality very closely, and sharing responses to a third object. And my third object, I mean really an artwork, right? A text. And today I'm going to try a little bit to have a little bit of a workshop with a poem that I just talked about recently. And a tool for building trust for our global health justice movement. I mean, and that's what we're about. For many years, we didn't think globally in the United States because we're an empire. And empires see themselves as always the central reference of the world. And I know as a social scientist that the motion of history is now in China, in India, in Brazil, in Africa, right? And the United States is a declining empire. And we have to begin to think globally in the midst of this empire, in the belly of this beast. And I think that's something that we need, and you have to have trust for that. The 3 movements of narrative medicine are attention, listening. Think about the time in your life when you were listened so well, so thoroughly, that someone was so present to you that you were transformed. That's the kind of attention and listening we try to promote in narrative medicine. And this comes from the origins of narrative medicine. Rita Sharon, Sayantani Dasgupta, Eric Marcus, Mora, I'm forgetting her name right now. The founders of narrative medicine, right? All are people who attend very closely to text. And they use that attending to make an analogy to listening. And then representation. And representation is taking what someone says and in one sense creating something out of it, right? And also returning it to them through affiliation, through the bond that's created. So we can think about these three movements as listening closely, representing what the person is saying. Think about a clinical encounter, right? Or a moment of teaching and learning, or a moment of a workshop, and affiliation, the bonds that we create with each other as a result of seeing each other in a different light. So listening. There was a wonderful radical lawyer and theologian, lay theologian, called William Stringfellow. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Stringfellow. And he says, listening is a rare habit among human beings. You cannot listen to the word another is speaking if you are preoccupied with your appearance or impressing the other, or you are trying to decide what you're going to say when the other stops talking, or if you are debating about whether the words being spoken is true or relevant or agreeable. Listening, in other words, is a primitive, I will use ancient act of love, in which a person gives themselves to another's word, making themselves accessible and vulnerable to that word. And I think with Stringfellow, what he's trying to say is this is our most ancient foundation, listening, right? And narrative medicine is trying to mine that in many ways in terms of health justice, but also in terms of obviously medical education. There are 6 principles of narrative medicine, intersubjectivity, that our reality is created between ourselves, right? And that so much of us have been trained in a type of individualism that really is a windowless house. And intersubjectivity, how meaning is constructed between people, between those spaces, that's an important idea. Relationality, that relations are important, that in fact, all we have are relations, that social reality is made up of processes and not things. Personhood embodiment, non-dualistic embodiment, that we are mind, body, spirit, soul, all those things together. Social justice, in this case, health justice. Close reading, as I've mentioned, or another way to put it, as some of the colleagues put it, slow looking, observing slowly. And of course, creativity. Why creativity? Well, from my perspective, to be a human being is to be engaged in a creative process, right? In producing ourselves, producing our society. Human beings are those animals, rational animals, that are emotional as well, that produce with each other, that produce a whole world. And creativity is key. One of the things about capitalism is that it narrows us, right? It takes those things that are most us, our ability to produce and labor creatively, to engage in creative, transformative act or transformational action, and they narrowly make it into a way to have a wage, right, to exploit labor throughout the world. Creativity is key. My colleague, Sanyantani Dasgupta, has helped us in many ways to think about many of the issues of narrative medicine, but certainly pedagogy. And her contributions have been the notion of narrative humility that comes from cultural humility, that we no matter how many times we listen to a person, we will never know that story from within. And even if we're experts, there is a call to a type of humility. And humility is the ability to be accountable. The ability to be accountable. Structural competency, which Dr. Hansen and Dr. Metzel have really developed, right? The ability to see what comes to us in the clinic, in the classroom, in the workshop, in the community struggle, that it's not about people being messed up. It's about the structures of violence that delimit their freedoms and at times crush their lives. And engaged pedagogy, which means that there's a vulnerability involved in here, that we're not robots, right? And that there's a human aspect to it. And I say again, graduate training, I don't care what kind it is, has this hierarchical element to it that we need to challenge, especially now If we don't challenge our teaching now, when are we going to do it? What more crisis do we need? 500,000 Americans have died, or residents of this country. How more do we need? We're living in a moment of crisis. We need to respond at that level. So narrative humility, my dear friend Sayantani Dasgupta says, in health humanities practice requires that we teachers and facilitators reflect our own power when we teach and elicit narratives from our students. If I'm teaching students who depend on me for their grades, how can I ensure that they feel both safe sharing their reflective writing and comfortable opting not to share? Silence is an option, right? Do I see myself as a didactic instructor? Here's the information, handing it over to you. Or as an educator, Paula Freire would suggest a co-learner. How do I understand my own prejudices and expectations, ensuring that all participants' voices are heard? Do I approach with defensiveness or openness those students who disrupt my plans or disagree with my teachings, right? It's the disruptive students that are the most creative ones. Those are the ones I want to hear from, because I'm going to learn something in that process as they are going to learn something. So narrative humility is combined with pedagogical engagement, and it's about being a co-learner, being a co-learner. So when you do a narrative medicine workshop, right, you usually have narrative medicine trained co-facilitators. You might have like 6 sessions. Sometimes they have more. And in the old public health language, they used to call these dosages, right? You have an aesthetic third object, which means something that people can focus on, right? That is creative, that moves them away from the workaday world to look at something that has beauty in it, but also has reality in it, struggle in it. And prompts, which are neither too specific or broad. I mean, that's sort of the rule. And then you have writing or response materials. So maybe you don't want to write, there might be other forms to do that. And 5 minutes of quiet writing time, sharing responses, and active listening. And what I've seen, in observing workshops is that, especially with interprofessional teams, it changes people because they begin to see each other in a different light. It's not just about the everyday and the scud work, right? Or the scuttle work, if you will. It's about this moment where we begin to talk to each other in a language that we don't normally use and begin to see each other again, right? See each other in a new way. I call this sort of soul work in my own writing. So in terms of this, I want to share with you a very quick poem by Lucille Clifton. And we can imagine being in a workshop and then having a prompt to this lovely poem. So I'm going to stop the share for now and share Lucille Clifton's poem. If you're just patient with me, we'll do this in a second. All right. And she grew up in Buffalo, New York. And I hope everyone can see it. Can everyone see it? I hope so. Yes. Give me some thumbs up here. Cool. Can see it? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. We can't see it. Okay. Can you see Lucille Clifton, though?
We see her picture, but the video hasn't started yet.
Okay. Okay. So can you see the video? Can you hear it? No? No? Can't hear it?
No.
Okay. Let me try it again. We'll get it. Okay. Here we go. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Lucille Clifton.
Assistant. Her first book, Good Times, was rated one of the best books of 1969 by the New York Times. Lucille Clifton, who said one should wish to celebrate more than wish to be celebrated.
Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed.
So that's Lucille Clifton. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. And obviously very powerful, right? And if we were in a narrative medicine workshop, we might ask the following question. Won't you celebrate with me, right? What does celebration and freedom look like now, right? And it depends on what you're doing, but you could make it to you, to us, right? So you get people to start thinking about that. And here's this Black woman, working class, grew up in Buffalo, New York, was a civil servant in the state of New York, wrote her poetry while she was working full time. And what is she saying? I had no role model. And every day something tried to kill me. Racial capitalism, white supremacy, sexism, right? And yet I remain, right? And yet I continue. It failed. Right? And those of us who come, and I'm sure there are many of you here, who come from first generation families, immigrant families, LGBTQ, those of you who have experienced gender oppression, right? Neurotypical, people of color, right? A lot of us don't have a role model, right? We had to create it as we went along, right? For me, believe it or not, it was reading at 23, the autobiography of Malcolm X, right? It wasn't Puerto Rican writers. It was reading that book that opened my mind, right? To realize, oh, for 10 years, people tried to make me an honorary white person and bourgeois and have me deny my class, my culture, my folks, right? So one of the things I would say when we look at narrative medicine, we can have people rediscover themselves using narrative medicine. And we need those rediscoveries because we live in a society that is predicated on the long forgetting, right? So when we see the racial justice rebellion, the largest rebellion since the 60s, right? Those of us who knew a little history would said, this was coming, right? And we see how, as people who are concerned about healthcare, we need to respond to this on some level or another. So, we'd have time, you would write, we would share, and maybe one day I'll come back and do an narrative medicine workshop with y'all if you like. And the workshop slows us down. And this is something I wrote a while ago. And basically I said the most effective way to enter and reshape a crisis is by refusing its logic of speed and unrelenting urgency. Because the crisis is designed to destroy your base, to destroy your political and social base, right? So you have to slow down, right? The critical and humane response is to slow down, take stock, and go deeper into the limits and possibilities within the contradictory social and cultural forms inherent in the wide institutional contours and interstices of the crisis at hand. So paradoxically, we're in a crisis, slow down. We slow down, why? To build trust. The forces of what I call unfreedom are antagonistic, even lethal to the full flourishing of human beings. And haven't we seen that this last year? This system depends on all of us ordinary people, professionally credentialed or not, right? If you're making a wage, or if I take away your check for 2 or 3 months and you're in trouble, guess what? You're a working person, I hate to tell you. Speeding up and going along with the time squeeze and work overload to unlearn and untangle the imposed state of being overwhelmed is part of the work of narrative medicine, right? So we're in a key tactical and strategic moment in this country. And I would say the 2 points that I want to bring out here are radical social movements for change take root and grow as trust builds and deepens. We must build movement trust. And I know there's a lot of conversations about race. Let's forget about the conversation. Let's talk about power and resources, right? Because the conversation is not the problem. It's not an epistemological problem. It's not a problem of knowledge. It's a problem of political struggle, power, and economics. And as an intellectual, right, I tend to think that everything's a knowledge problem, right? right? To a hammer, everything's a nail. Right? But we need something more than that. We need change, radical change. So one of the things I'm working on now is, of course, this podcast that I just did the first episode of the second season. It's called Karl Marx Ate My Field Notes. And I was thinking about remembering our possible futures, right? And go back to Dr. Du Bois, right? Whenever the U.S. enters a period of revolutionary changes, as it has in this period, right? And remember, revolutions can be fascist, or they can be, revolutions towards liberation. Just remember that. Racialized civil war emerges in various forms. And that's what we're dealing with. That's what the January 6th events were. Sort of a clarion call to the right. We're going to go get these people. Right? So we need a third reconstruction. The first reconstruction is documented, how it was designed to fail by Dr. Du Bois, despite the agency of freed slaves, the freed Africans. The second reconstruction was the civil rights movement, and we need a third reconstruction. And what are this? And let's go back to James Baldwin for a minute, right? I'm a Bronxite, but he was a Harlemite. And in Notes of a Native Son, in that essay that he writes about Everybody's Protest novel, which is a sort of a response to Richard Wright, he says, society is held together by our need. We bind it together with legend, myth, coercion. Legend, myth, coercion. Think of the time we've just lived and how myth, coercion, and legend have joined. Fearing that without it, we will be hurled into the void, within which the foundations of society are hidden. From this void, ourselves, think about that. He's saying we're a void, actually. It is the function of society to protect us. But it is only in this void, what he calls our unknown selves, collectively and individually, demanding forever a new act of creation which can save us. With that same motion, at that same time, it is toward which we endlessly struggle and from which endlessly we struggle to escape. What are we escaping? The new act of creation. So Baldwin saw the American dilemma as the refusal to confront the void of history, the void of violence, right? Of structural violence, of racial capitalism. And we need that new act of creation. And we're constantly moving towards it and moving away from it. And that's how you do conjunctural analysis, actually. You say, okay, what are the forces moving towards freedom and what are the ones, and what's the balance of those forces? So a new act of creation or the void, right? These are the times we live in. And the stakes are monumentally high, comrades. We need collective democratic discernment and unity. And unity not as a fantasy, right? Not like a sort of like you add that on, almost like a display mannequin, right? But unity as the recognition of concrete shared needs in their differential expression, right? I recognize your need, that this society is based upon the denial of mass collective needs so other people can have wonderful lives, right? That deadly nexus, that means that every meal we have has been subsidized by undocumented immigrants, not too far away from here in the valleys. And that we need to clear that out. We need to figure out the desire need nexus. But you have to recognize the concrete shared needs in their differential expression. So what are the void choices? And here I'm being provocative for pedagogical reasons. A non-redistributive, corporate curated diversity. Now, don't go around saying, Dr. Rivera doesn't like diversity. Now, don't say that, right? I'm saying that it's non-redistributive and docile institutional multiculturalism, right? Incorporation into the system as long as the money game doesn't get disturbed, right? The money game. Or a white nationalist populism and market authoritarianism, Jim Crow 2.0, or neo-fascism, depending on where you are. In Hungary, it's neo-fascism, what I could tell, right? In other places, something else, right? In India, that'd be a mixture of capitalism, a type of Hindu nationalism, right? Are those the choices we want? Is that why we educated ourselves, right? And intersectional imperialism, right? As we begin to leave Afghanistan, a place that people told the policymakers not to go to because Alexander the Great had failed, the British had failed, the Soviets had failed, and now we're leaving. So what narrative medicine can do, at least, is create the small conditions of the workshop. And I think about this as like what happened in the feminist movement when women got together and had consciousness raising sessions, or in the Black freedom movement, the role of the church, the discipline and traditions of the Black church as a starting point. And so what I think about is that narrative medicine is one of the tools to create the trust, the unity, to deal with what is ahead. And I tell you, frankly, that racialized types of civil wars will continue in the United States. And I think right now there's a new hegemony being constructed through the Biden-Harris administration, and they're trying to prevent the worst, right? But the ecological crisis, the pandemic really being a result of large agribusiness policies that were pulled together by large corporate monies, such that the invasion of these territories have connected, let's say in one case, bats to human beings. And the problem isn't that poor human beings eat or do something with bats. The problem is a non-regenerative agribusiness economy, a non-regenerative farming. And that's going to continue, right? So from my standpoint, and I think I'm being honest when I say this is the moment when we need to push ourselves into new forms of thinking and living. And these void choices are not good, right? One may be better than the other, but it's not enough. And we are in the crisis of our lives. And we need to create new alternatives that I see in lots of places, right? I see in lots, in my own case, in those Los Angeles tenant unit, right? But I see it all over the country, right? And comrades all over the world who are working on, solutions. And clearly we need to scale up. And I hope this invitation, this primer in narrative medicine, it's only a beginner, really. We should have done a workshop session, right? And maybe we'll one day, is a provocation to new thinking, to new feeling, and to consider what the project of freedom is and what freedom looks like, sounds like, tastes like, feels like when it comes to health justice, right? In this historical moment, en la coyuntura actual política, right? And I want to end with one of my favorite anthropologists, who's Ricardo Falla, who's a Jesuit priest who spent many years living amongst la comunidad de resistencia indígena, the indigenous resistance communities in Guatemala, Mayan communities who were basically, what genocide was, basically committed against them. And Ricardo lived with those communities underground. And I want to come back to why we started this process in the beginning. What I mean we is, why did we decide to hitch our wagons to the question of healing? And Ricardo has a very good answer. He's a wise old man. He says in this recent book, he's got a couple of volume collection, and there's an essay on the dusk of life. Of course, he's thinking about his own mortality. He says, at the dusk of life, you won't be examining how many books you've written, nor how many buildings you've erected, nor how many positions you've had, or even how many sick people you've saved from death. What matters is how much you've loved, how much love you've put into everything you've done. Now that sounds sappy, right? But for me, our work is that, right? And the challenges that we have in the society we're living in now is the lovelessness of it. And I think that narrative medicine is a contribution to responding to that and to creating some tools for that. And as we think about reforming medical education, thinking about the struggles that come ahead, right? We need to be fit, right? Body, soul, and mind to confront these struggles. Thank you so much for inviting me to have this, well, I don't, it's not a conversation yet, but the beginning of this discussion. Thank you.
Wow, such a poetic ending to an entirely poetic presentation and rousing presentation. Thank you. We have a question that I want to maybe augment with a connected question. So the first question is, Dr. Mark Lamont Hill has critiqued academia, stating that academics often theorize about the structural problems of the real world without going out into the real world and meeting struggling people. How can workshops and community engagement in narrative medicine work to change that paradigm?
Right.
And so I just want to, I have a number of questions, but I'll just connect one I think that's similar. So you started by laying out these enormous structural forces, political, economic forces that shape the kind of medicine that we practice and all of the horrible consequences, the contradictions of, a health system that kills people in essence.
Yep.
And so my question is, how can narrative medicine, with its insistence on listening, humility, and learning from the patient, self-examination, how can it push back against such huge, overdetermined political economic machines? And I wonder if you can give us examples, concrete examples of how you've seen narrative medicine training lead to changes in systems or policies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that with narrative medicine, it's, first of all, we're a young movement, right? We only began about 20 years ago. But I think the answer to that question will come later on as we see it applied in different contexts. It needs, honestly, it needs to leave the academy, right? It needs to go into, and it's beginning, to the prison systems, to the community, to different communities of struggle, to the LA Tenants Union, right? So these different places. And I think Dr. Lamont Hill is spot on, right? And academia is a machine, right? It's an institutional machine. You can analyze like you can analyze the Bank of America, right? And the reality is that I think of myself as an intellectual that came out of the working classes. Being an academic is a job, right? I was always an intellectual, right? And the question is, given that what I have here is a product of social resources, how do I re-socialize my intellectual means of production? By being connected to social movement and in the service of social movement, not just as intellectuals, but as militants, right? As people who like clean up and move chairs and do the practical work. I think what the academy does is isolate people at times, right? And academics have to make a choice. And luckily, in your case, in the UCLA, it's a medical school. You have a clinical practice that's urgent. You have to deal with people's problems. You cannot be in the ivory tower and be working with people, right? But I think academia itself is, in one sense, many ways, part of the problem, right? It separates people. And that's a dangerous thing, right? Because the minute academics are separated from social struggle, they're much more easy. It's easier to knock them off politically, to get them, sort of, and isolate them. Why was the Red Scare partially begun in Hollywood? Because these people didn't have a base. They were easier to attack, right? And then they went for the labor movement, right? They had a real base. So I would say that I would agree with Dr. Lamont Hill, right? And then the question is, if you're in these institutions, how do you do the jiu-jitsu to create the space for others to be trained and bring it to our folks, right? Like what I have in my head doesn't belong to me. It's not individual property. It was individual property in the beginning. So how do I socialize it? In my humble way is connecting to social movements, doing my little podcast, and realizing that I will never, there'll come a day when I won't be an academic, but I still will be here in the fight, right? And I think that's one way to think about it. How narrative medicine will do that in terms of policy change. That's for people to take it there, That's for people who are narrative medicine people to take it to those areas where policy change is discussed. I'm more of a movement person. I think movements build the conditions for policy change. So I'm convinced that what happened in Minneapolis in terms of that trial was a direct result of the rebellions that occurred in the summer. It probably wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So I think for me, that's always the point of return. You need to go back to that.
Fantastic. So another question on behalf of global health practitioners. So I apologize that I'm going to expose you. that one thing I didn't mention was that my understanding is you started or at one point in your career, you were in Central America as a Jesuit priest and organizer. And I should have mentioned that in addition to critical race theory and other critical theories, your scholarly orientation includes post-colonial decolonizing theory, liberation movements. And I'm wondering what role you see for these approaches within global health and what narrative medicine might contribute to global health. Because in relation also to our domestic social inequalities and power inequalities. But certainly here at the School of Medicine, we have a lot of interest in global health. And we're trying to figure out how to do global health in a way that will actually contribute to a shift in the way that these relationships between the US and other countries and medical practitioners and people who aren't medical practitioners unfold.
Right. So one of my trainings, you didn't expose me to that. Me being an ex-Jesuit, it's public knowledge. And Central America was one of my schools. And liberation theology, and specifically liberation theology. And I still am convinced that liberation theology is true, at least from my perspective. I guess the question underneath that is how not to do colonial medicine, how not to replicate the logic of the empire, right? And I guess the key thing would be, I mean, first of all, I see narrative medicine, and this is maybe my particular perspective on it, probably is, as soul work, as work that produces a collective soul that creates the energy for motion, right? For social motion, right? And I think that may be idiosyncratic to me. So don't, I mean, some of the other colleagues that I read would have a different perspective. But for me, I think one of the things I would ask is, what is the global? What is the global and what is the local? What does it mean in a metropolitan city like LA, which is a global hub, to talk about the global and the local, right? And for me, at least in terms of liberation theology, the philosophy of liberation, it's a question of breaking down institutional privileges and what resources are going to be redistributed. So it's not just the question of, you're taking resources to someplace else in the global south. It's a question of, does the institution that has more resources redistribute them, right? And leave them in place in a sustainable way in the global south. And that's about building capacity, but also about decolonization, literally, right? Like, how do you do that is the question of the day in many ways, when we know that the point of decolonial thinking is colonialism hasn't ended, right? I mean, I'm only here because the United States invaded Puerto Rico in 1898, Jack. My parents met in Jersey, and they would have never met, probably, right? And I wouldn't exist had the United States not decided to go to Puerto Rico and mess up the economy, and people went up in the Great Migration from 45 on, right? So the question that we need to think about as people who are interested in an abolitionist decolonial medicine or healthcare is, how do we do that? And it's, again, the problem is not a discursive one. It's a practical political one. How do we have the institution recognize that its resources, they're rich because of imperialism, because of the relationship between the global north and the global south? Why is one of the richest Jesuit universities, Georgetown, now doing reparation? Because they wouldn't have existed had they not sold the Africans they owned to keep the institution going. Those are the questions. This is the kind of work that Craig Stephen Wildwood does, the historian, pointing to these various elite institutions and their indebtedness to the slave trade and indigenous land, the whole 9 yards. What, Evelyn Nakano Glenn calls the settler state.
Mm. So well put. So I have a couple more questions. Tracy Wells, I want to invite you to jump in if you have pressing questions, but I have a couple more and I see we're almost out of time.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Mine isn't pressing and I know how to reach him.
Okay, I think these are related questions. You talked about slowing down and refusing the neoliberal logic of speed that we all experience in clinical medicine. And so the question is about how we can do this in the current moment when people are dying so publicly, when we actually feel pulled in so many different directions to support colleagues, trainees, patients of color. So I'm wondering if you can give examples of what the practice of slowing down is and how it ultimately helps to serve the goal of responding to the crisis. And related to that, could you say a little bit more about how to operationalize love in medical practice?
Oh, tiny questions. That's good. I'm writing a book called Love Comes in Knots, right? Meditations in the American Labyrinth. And I've been thinking a lot about love. But to be honest, I think part of the question, let's say, especially for colleagues who've come from non-traditional backgrounds, first-generation colleagues, the institution has to make a decision that reparations is time in terms of protecting their self-development, right? At the same time, we're living a crisis, right? We know LA has gone down, the R number has gone down, the cases have gone down at this moment, but we're not separated from India, and the idea that somehow there's this, wall that's going to separate us from the world. No, Jack, it was the United States that created globalization with European allies, right? And just as I can go from here to India in so many hours, or to, Kenya, right? So can a virus, right? And so I think that the institution has to make a discernment. People don't want to do reparations in money, time, right? Because if time is unmanageable and unpayable debt in people's lives, then the system wins, right? Because then we have to change the question of time. Marx said it in Grundrisse. He says, capitalism annihilates space through time. And think about what our relationship to time has been during this pandemic. Those of us who stayed home, parts of my family were frontline, a majority of my family was frontline workers. They didn't, right? Some of them got sick. 2 people died. So I think that we have to sit down institutionally and say, okay, what does reparations mean now? Especially to those who don't have intergenerational wealth to depend on. When my folks passed, nothing was there. I mean, they had houses, they lost the house, right? So if reparations is anything, it's like saying, we will provide the institutional resource and intergenerational resources. And then this is the question, especially for those of us who are of a certain age. How do we mentor folks in a way that doesn't allow the social conditions of this society to decompose them? And I don't mean that, physically. I mean, the capitalist class, the elites that run the society, that run racial capitalism, are constantly decomposing the militancy of working people. And whatever structures of surveillance and sort of control that you have, they're direct responses to the possibilities that ordinary people are resisting, right? And I think one of the things we need to realize, and this is about attention and observation, is that ordinary people are already incredible strategists. We just got to listen and see, right? And that's anthropology teaches us that's for sure. Like ethnography, like what's the structure of this group? Who's in power here? What are the strategies, right? I don't think that's a direct answer, but I hope it's useful. And one of the things I would say to folks is, start thinking strategically, scaling up, right? And consider the fact that another pandemic may occur, right? That this may not be our first time. And we need to be serious about that, but grounded, right? And this is the thing that the LGBTQ movement taught me. Do what gives you pleasure in this struggle. Make sure that it is a beautiful struggle, right? That it's not like a dirge, right? It's something beautiful, the beautiful struggle.
On that note,
Mhm.
thank you for introducing poetry as well as narrative to our
Sure.
medical practice.
Sure.
And
My
thanks so
pleasure.
much for
Thank
joining us.
you. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Helena.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rivera Colon, and I can't wait to look up your book when it's ready. So think of me, keep me posted. Very interested in learning more about this. And, our team is very interested as well in learning more about engaging in narrative medicine in a skilled and meaningful way, and hope to participate in the training. I just want to give everybody the heads up who's still with us about our next grand rounds, which will be on Tuesday, May 18th, bright and early at 8 a.m. With Dr. Aidil Haider, and he's the Dean of the Medical School at Aga Khan University in Karachi, Pakistan. And watch out for an email to invite you to this next event. Thank you again so much for the wonderful talk. Have a great night, everyone.